Just chick-chack review. We said that Hashem goes to Mitzrayim, he goes on a Av Kal. Av is Gematria 72, the Acharayim of the Shem Pashut of Hashem. Somebody tell me what that is. Acharayim of the Shem Pashut.
Which one, Acharayim or Pashut?
Acharayim of the Shem Pashut. What is that? Someone explain that. Alright, that's right. Did everyone get that though? Getting a lot of blank faces from the peanut gallery over here. No? Besides Rabbi Baruch? Nobody knows? Okay.
Keep adding the letter as you spell the word out.
Right, the Acharayim, as he said, is you start with Yud, and you add Yud K, and you add Yud K Vav, Yud K Vav K.
Right.
Why is it called Pashut? That's called Acharayim. That system of adding is called Acharayim, the backside. What's Pashut about it? Yes, did everyone understand that?
Yeah.
Because it's just Yud K Vav K. That process, if you have the Miloyim, would be a totally different thing. It would be like, for example, Yud would be Yud Vav Dalet. And then you want to add K, you're going to add Yud K to that, it would be Yud Vav Dalet Hey Aleph. Because that's how you spell Hey. And if you want to add Yud K Vav to that, you would take that and you would add Yud Vav Dalet Hey Aleph Vav Aleph Vav. Does that make sense? Or he lost you there?
I was thinking about something. Go ahead.
Anyway, without going into all the spelling, look at footnote 100.
Yeah.
Footnote 100 is the Acharayim of the Shem Havaya, but not Pashut, but rather with Miloy Aleph. So you see, if you see there, it says Yud, and then after the comma Yud K, after the comma Yud K Vav, and then Yud K Vav K, but they're all spelled out, not just the simple letters. So that's called the Acharayim of the, not the Shem Pashut, of the Shem Havaya with Miloy Aleph. Yeah, everyone gets it? You get that, Laser? Yeah? Levi? Okay, so those two things together, basically the Shem Pashut and the Shem with the Miloy is called 72 and 130. That's how much the Gematrias add up to. That's called Av Kal. So we're saying when Hashem goes into Egypt, he goes on the Av Kal, which means that he contracts himself into this level of Acharayim. He doesn't show the straight Kedusha from Yud K Vav K, as it is. And one level of contraction after the next, because basically the Shem Pashut, without spelling out the letters, is a little bit higher than the Miloy. Because we said that when you have a Miloy of something, you only use it when you say the letter with speech. Whereas when you think the letter, you only need to think the singular letter. When you say it out, you actually have to pronounce the other letters that are sort of contained inside of there. The Aleph winds up having a Lamed and a Pei. When you just think of an Aleph, it's just the one letter. So therefore, going from the Shem Hashem Pashut to the Shem Hashem with Miloy is a descent. And in general, the whole idea of Acharayim is a descent. So we have two levels of descent. Descending into the Acharayim, and then from the Acharayim itself, descending into the Miloy. So we're saying that this is basically going into Mitzrayim, which is the lowest level of Chutz La'aretz, of outside of Eretz Yisrael, Egypt meaning constraint. So Hashem goes on the Av, and not only the Av, but the Av Kal. And if you add those two letters, those two Gematrias together, 70 and 130, you get the Gematria of Rav. Rav, which the Zohar says that any rabbi who lives in Eretz Yisrael is called Rav, not Rebbe. Right? Because what happens when you what happens when you call him Rebbe is that he gets the Yud slapped back on. The Yud is like a tikkun for that whole process we just said. Why? Because if you take the name of Hashem spelled out with a Miloy, all of its letters, like the sort of lowest level, the idea of the Miloy, and you want to bring all that back up into one letter, so as opposed to, you're going to make, from the Miloy, you're going to make it Pashut again. And we already said that the concept of Gematria sometimes can serve in a way where you bring something up into its root as it is before the distinctions come out. So therefore the Yud happens to be the Gematria of 10, which contains all the 10 letters of the Miloy, and it's the one singular letter as opposed to a whole spelled out letter. So it has this quality of that represents the bittul, which anyway Yud represents a bittul. So it brings all that level of Rav and contraction. It's Rebbe. It brings it back up to sort of its refined state, and that's why rabbis in Eretz Yisrael are called Rebbe, not Rav. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's cool. Everyone follows all that?
What was the Rebbe called Rebbe?
Yeah.
Because he was an Eretz Yisraelnik.
Oh.
And we just learned a sicha that the grave of the Rebbe has a higher level of kedusha than the whole Eretz Yisrael. And they proved it with Mamash Rayas from the Gemara and everything something.
But it's only once he passes away, though.
Huh?
That's only his grave.
No. So why does his grave have that? You know, as we said, a grave in general. Remember the sicha says, since the grave is in the future going to open up into Eretz Yisrael, so it has the din of Eretz Yisrael. Right. But there's a disadvantage, because in Zman Hazeh, Eretz Yisrael fell further than Chutz La'aretz. So what's the big chiddush? You're going to open up to Eretz Yisrael in the time of Galus. It's like Adarab, it's a problem.
Right.
So we said not to worry, because the Rebbe is holding by a level of Eretz Yisrael before the destruction, like the Rashbi. So that's for sure in existence when he's still alive. Right? In other words, the idea that the Rebbe is holding before the Churban is not just something that happens when he passes away. It's like his continuous status. Anyway, so there's such a thing as Rebbe. Anyway, there's a concept of what does it mean Aretz and Chutz La'aretz anyway. Aretz, why is it called Aretz? Gemara says, Sheratz lasos ratzon kona, right? She ran to do the will of her maker. The word Eretz has like a dual meaning. It's like a triple meaning. It means land, but then it also comes to the word to run, and it also comes to the word will. All in one word, basically. So it says she ran to do the will of her maker. So the idea is that the Eretz Yisrael, the Aretz, it has this thing about like someone running to do the will of their maker. So a Yid is called also Eretz Chafetz. We're called a desirable land. So someone who's called Chutz La'aretz is not necessarily a place. Right? Because Rashi says anyone who dwells in Chutz La'aretz is like they don't have a God. So it says that Mamash in his parish in the Chumash. So all the great Rebbeim, basically since the time of Babel, they all lived Chutz La'aretz. None of them had a God. They wrote the Gemara. They wrote it's impossible to say. So what does it mean? It's not a joke. So Chutz La'aretz actually means chutz, to outside of the ratzon of Hashem. Out, like when you can be in Eretz Yisrael anywhere you are, as long as you're the Aretz, which means you're running to do the will of Hashem. You could be in Eretz Yisrael and you can still be standing chutz la'aretz, because you're not running to do the will of Hashem. So the Aretz is sort of like anyway, that's the point. You could be a Rebbe because you are in Eretz Yisrael.
Who said that?
The Rebbe? Who said what? This whole drasha?
Yeah.
That's the Rebbe's little drasha.
Oh.
So it means you can be chutz in the land.
Yeah. Chutz la'aretz is like an attitude, basically. And on the contrary, the Rebbe oftentimes said that sometimes he would discourage people to move to Eretz Yisrael. Not often, but once in a while you see, he would say it's not something you just you go there and you think you're going to be holy. On the contrary, you go there, and if you don't raise your level of Kedusha, then you diminish the level of holiness in the land. And it's not just like, I don't know, it's a tricky thing. Like birthright's great, it brought us down. But the idea of bringing a whole bunch of people over here just so they can be in Eretz Yisrael, it does. I can't knock it. I mean, it's an amazing thing. But in a certain level, I don't want to take this too far because we want the Yidden. But bring a whole bunch of people here just to stam party in Tel Aviv for a while. It's not lav dafka. Is that the thing to do? You know what I'm saying? Like we can tinker with that trip a little bit perhaps and make it a little bit more Eretz Yisrael-dik.
Make more people go to
Anyway, Hashem will help us. Okay, we got to do our jobs, learn Chassidus. What page are we on, Michal? Okay, here we are. So then that was one. Then we went into Os Ches, and we started talking about the next phase of this journey, which is the notion that Einei Hashem Elokecha ba. We talked about that. There's two psukim the Zohar brings out that seem to have a little bit different thing going. One is that the eyes of the land, the eyes of Hashem are on the land. The eyes of Hashem are on His righteous ones. And the other one is that the eye of Hashem is on those who fear Him. Eye and eye, singular and plural. What's the story? So we said that in general, the eyes represent the union of chochma. Why? because we see that the chachamim, the wise ones, the sages, they're called the einei ha'edah. They're called the eyes of the congregation. So we right away see that the idea of eyes is connected with the level of chochma, which is this idea of wisdom. And then, of course, we know that chochma is connected with bittul, right? Because that's the whole idea of chochma. Chochma is the same letters as koach ma, the power of what? The power of nullifying yourself, of bittul. Bittul is an Indian of fear. So we said there's like a little bit of like an equation going on. So what is the idea of there's I and eyes? It means there's two levels of chochma. There's chochma ilah, higher chochma, and chochma tata, lower chochma, and therefore along with that goes yira ilah and yira tata, the higher fear and the lower fear. So he said that the lower fear is the idea of just fear of someone's greatness, that you only recognize them in an external way. You only know that they're like big and scary, but you don't know them. You don't know who they are. You don't know their panemius, their inwardness. So you're afraid of them, pepashtus. You see how like powerful they are. Versus a higher level of fear when you come to know the quality of the king. And then it's a whole different level of fear. You're not like afraid of him. You have awe of him, of his majesty and his greatness and how wondrous and precious he is. So that also leads to a level of fear, but it's a higher level of fear. It's yira ilah, the higher fear, which is called yira boshes, a fear of like embarrassment, of like even having a self, like you sort of can't even find yourself. Anything you're going to look at yourself, it's like meaningless and insignificant compared to like the one who has everything, and you're afraid to even like express any expression of yourself because it's an embarrassment to show yourself in the face of all that. Just like feel dwarfed and nullified. So this is the higher fear. Okay, so we left this off basically right in the middle of paragraph ches. First line, the first word in the line starts with umamshich leva'er. Right, so we just got finished explaining higher fear and lower fear. Everyone sees? Place?
Yeah.
Umamshich leva'er, and we go on to explain shekadei lios yira boshes, in order to arrive at this higher level of fear of embarrassment, awe, tzrich la'akir la'asig es elokusu yizbarech. You can only get there by really knowing and grasping, recognizing real godliness. In other words, it's one thing to sort of have a realization that there's a God, there's a mitzvah. Suddenly, like you start looking through the Rambam, you see all these commandments. Whoa! Like I'm commanded by God. That puts a certain level of fear of you. Like, what have I been doing with my whole life up until now? But that's the lower fear. To get to a place where you have the higher fear, it's like a full recognition of your Creator. You're sort of like able to peer at Him and know who He is and know godliness. And really, you can never know godliness. He can never let himself be known to you unless there's a tzimtzum, unless he contracts himself to you. Because how are you going to know something that's unknowable? How are you going to recognize it? Lasig is to grasp. You can only grasp something that's graspable. Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu mitzamtzem es atzmo kiviyachol. That Hashem contracts himself, so to speak, yucholim lasigo, so that it's even possible and within the realm to grasp him. V'zeh tzimtzum ba al yedei shiaktin adam es atzmo. So it's a kamayim hapanim lepanim situation. So what is it? Kamayim hapanim lepanim means like water reflects a face. It's a reciprocation. Hashem is only going to agree to contract himself into being graspable by you if you contract yourself. You have to make yourself small. We already mentioned this at great length in a previous chapter in this mimer regarding the idea of chesed ilah and chesed tata. If you remember, the higher chesed and the lower chesed, we talk gedula and chesed. You remember this conversation? That gedula is basically we said there's the big chesed and the small chesed. And we wound up saying that the small chesed is not small. In fact, it's not any smaller than the big chesed. Why is it called small then? Does anyone remember? Because you have to make yourself small in order to get to it. And in fact, it's in a certain sense, therefore, it's bigger than the big chesed. Why? Because the big chesed has like a certain limitation to it, which is that no one can ever see it except for Hashem. Because it's so big, it's infinite, it doesn't allow itself to be expressed. It's like thought versus speech. It doesn't have the ability to sort of show itself, because something which is infinite, as we just mentioned here, ungraspable, which Hashem is, He's big, He can't show Himself, because how can you grasp something ungraspable? But if you make yourself small, exceedingly small, like shtika, silence, which is like beyond a total humility, so then since you are no longer like an entity which is like opposing the revelation of something, now infinity can flow through you, and therefore it's called the small chesed, because that you are a vessel to make yourself small allows the big giant chesed to have a place that it can now actually shine and reveal itself. So the same thing we're saying here about chochma. In order to have this like higher fear, which is basically ungraspable, it has to agree to show itself and become graspable. The only way that it will do that is if it reciprocates your action of making yourself small. And that is basically like water reflects a face. If you contract yourself, Hashem will contract Himself. And it's like the whole thing comes down to the letter Yud, basically. The letter Yud, from Yud Kei Vav Kei, in order for anything to be seen from Hashem, it starts off with a Yud, which means that the very first Yud Kei Vav Kei is basically all the worlds, and how Hashem reveals Himself. He reveals His name. But in order for that process to happen, the first of all the letters is a Yud, which means that Hashem has to basically contract Himself into a tiny point in order to even become the beginning of the Hishtalshlus. And even in order to express anything, it starts off with a Yud, where He removes His infinity and He basically sends it through a finite point. So that means you also have to go through this Hishtalshlus. You have to first make yourself into a Yud. And when you make yourself into a Yud, you make Hashem turn into a Yud, and then He sort of enters the fray of being able to be seen. Yeah, no, there's no question. The Yud and the Yid is one thing. As we were saying, what's the difference between, I was talking to Dan yesterday, what's the difference between Hodu and Yehuda? So my rabbi told me this one time, because I remember the Dalai Lama came to town. I was living in Oregon, and all the bookstores, the Dalai Lama, everywhere, everyone was like dressing up like the Dalai Lama. It was like a little strange little village there, Portland, Oregon. And I went to him and I said, like, you know, all this spirituality, like, do we have this? I mean, in Judaism also, you know. So he said to me, listen, just because something's spiritual doesn't necessarily mean that it's holy. And that was the first time I ever heard that concept. Right? Just like in physicality, you can have physical things that are holy, and you can have physical things that are not holy. Just most people think that if you go into the spiritual, you're automatically dealing with something holy, because if it's not physical, it must be something holy. But it's not true. Also in spirituality, you have a division between holy and non-holy. So he said that the Indian of Hodu is a certain recognition. Hodu means you recognize, which means you recognize that there's something beyond this place. But if it doesn't have the Yid, if it doesn't have the Yud, which is the bittul, basically, then you're just recognizing like stam spirituality beyond this world. But it's a plural. You're recognizing many gods. Where if you have the Yehuda, it's the same thing as Hodu, but with a Yud. It's basically you're realizing that God contracts Himself into a certain expression, and that's even spiritually where you'll find it. So you can't get excited just because someone can levitate, which seems like that guy's got the right idea. I want to eat what he's eating, you know. Lav davka, you know. There's mamish spiritual wonders that's not necessarily coming from the side of kedusha. V'zeu masha kusuv. So going on, this is what it says, Gabi Eretz Yisrael, Einei Hashem Elokecha Ba. So when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, it says the eyes of Hashem are on it. And there again we see this language, Einei Lashon Rabim, plural eyes. The Hine, what does it mean? This plural. Eretz Hu Bechinas Malchus. So first and foremost, we know that the land represents Malchus, the lowest sphera, the sort of receiver of all the higher levels. Sheyesh ba inyan habitul. And we know that Malchus is defined by having bitul, because we said that for already weeks, that the Dalid has a Yud on the back. The Dalid represents Malchus. The Yud on the back represents the intrinsic ability for her to mevatel herself and nullify herself to what's above her. So the Eretz is an Indian of bitul. Kamavur b'maimer perik vav. V'yesh ba hamayla de'or chozer. And we're saying is that she has the maila, what's called or chozer. What's or chozer? What's or chozer?
Returning light?
Returning light. So what does it mean exactly, Or Choser? It's a deep thing, really.
Yeah.
But in general, we're saying that. Okay, in this context, he doesn't totally clarify it, but in general, what we need to know right now, in order just to read the next paragraph, is that there's two levels of light. There's Or Yashar and there's Or Choser. There's a straight light and there's a returning light, right? And you could say, in a certain sense, this is like the idea of the sun and the moon, right? That there's a certain light that comes from above to below, and that's just energized from Hashem. He gives light to this world, and there's a light that's generated from below to above. In other words, we actually create a further light, which is called Or Choser. The moon takes a light which is not her own and reflects it and makes something new. In other words, the sun has a certain limitation. It can't shine at night on the earth. But the moon, because it takes the light of the sun and reflects it, it can bring, it's called a reflecting light, a returning light. It takes a light and sort of returns it somewhere else. It can all of a sudden bring a light to where the sun cannot bring light. That's an Or Choser. So Or Choser has something in a certain sense over and above the Or Yashar, in that it can bring light to places where the Or Yashar cannot necessarily go. So the idea being is linking exactly into the concept that we said before. What's the Or Yashar? It's like the idea of Gedula that we said before. It's like an unbridled, infinite light from Hashem. But the problem is, it's so infinite that it can't actually get to earth, because we can't grasp it, right? It's God's infinite presence, which is completely ungraspable. So it's great. It's like it's a light that He's got going, which is beyond the worlds. But that's its limitation as well, that it stays beyond the worlds. The Or Choser represents basically the aretz, this bittul, right, which makes it so that it can take that light and reflect it to the dark places that the sun cannot reach, right? And so that's really the quality of what this sphere of Malchus has. The aretz, specifically, which, as we said before, is this idea of having the will to run after and do your maker. Like every Jew is called Eretz Yisrael. So it means that if you make yourself bittul, you bring godly light into a place where, so to speak, God cannot bring it Himself, strangely as it sounds. Because it requires your nullity in order to get godliness to come into this place. And so this is what it means, the two eyes, right? The chochma ilah and the chochma tata, the higher fear and the lower fear. We said that in order to get to this higher fear, you have to bittul yourself. In order to perceive this godliness, right, and recognize Him, it can only come if Hashem makes Him into a yud, which only happens if you make yourself into a yud. So the higher fears only becomes available if someone nullifies themselves, like Malchus, becomes the Aretz. So therefore it says Eretz Yisrael, which is the Indian of Aretz, Malchus, it has this Indian of Or Choser. It has this Indian of reflecting light. It has a chance to reach to the place of like truly recognizing God, because it comes with this bittul. So the usually unseen levels of godliness, of chochma, come out and can be seen in, so to speak, Eretz Yisrael. When a person has this Indian of the Aretz and lowers themselves and condenses themselves, they therefore condense the infinite levels of Hashem and allow them to be seen. So suddenly you have the Einei Hashem. You have the two eyes of Hashem. You have not only the external chochma, which also exists in Chutz La'aretz, because what is the external chochma? Just the realization that Hashem is big, but not really knowing Him, not really being able to contain His true bigness and have a recognition of it. That extends also to the Chutz La'aretz. Everybody recognizes sort of God is big, but to actually know God's bigness and allow the God Himself to be funneled in here, the penimius of Elokus, that requires a bittul, that requires the yud. You can only get that in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it has a double eye. It has the lower and the higher eye. Listen, it's a hard thing to explain, but I think that was pretty good. All right, because he doesn't really say it in too many words here, but we could try it again. What's that?
Talking about physically Eretz Yisrael.
We are, but also not. In other words, again, Eretz Yisrael is an Indian.
If everybody is Eretz Yisrael, if you do enough bittul, then it doesn't matter if you're in China or you're here or anywhere.
Right. It says Basi Eretz Yisrael is Pashut b'chol ha'artos. In the future, Eretz Yisrael will extend itself to all the nations. But why is that? Because Yidden are there making it Eretz Yisrael. Machda Eretz Yisrael is a famous statement of the Rabbi that, it's actually from the Tzemach Tzedek, and it was a line that a chassid wanted to move to Israel, and he repeatedly asked the Tzemach Tzedek, like, can I go? They didn't want to go without a bracha from the Rebbe. So the Rebbe wouldn't give him a bracha. And at the end he said, Machda Eretz Yisrael, make here Eretz Yisrael. Right? Make here Eretz Yisrael. So that just sort of remained in the Hasidic, storybooks until the Rebbe brought that out and said, I'd like to discuss that with you people. That's a reality. Like, you can actually make here Eretz Yisrael. It's not a joke. You can bring the same Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael to China, even to India. That might be a tough one, but there are a lot of Chabad houses trying to do that in India. Okay, so he says, so ultimately it's possible. Certainly there's a leg up over here because Hashem already made this in the Eretz Yisrael. It has like an intrinsic quality of being able to do that. It has its own bittul because it's in the Torah.
Mm-hmm. Probably don't have to work as hard because it's already there.
You can work harder.
Both true.
Maybe he's saying, Enei Hashem
Elokecha ba.
Elokecha ba, maybe he's talking about the eyes of God or in every Jew who makes himself Eretz Yisrael. He could run it the same way, because that's what he's saying, basically.
100%. L'chein Enei Hashem Elokecha ba, Enei Lashon Rabbi. This is the Indian of double eye. Sheyesh ba lo rak hayira hachitzonis shemachmas gadlo. That you don't just have the external fear because Hashem is great. In other words, think about Gedula for a second, right? Gedula, we said, is the idea of godliness which doesn't make it here because it's too big. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect you. It affects you at a big time. The point is, let's think of it as in a physical mashal. You come to the king's palace and you see legions upon legions of people and great people bowing down to him and serving him. So this gives you a fear. You have no idea who the king is. You've never even seen his face. You don't know him. You don't know his personality. But just the fact that you see all the legions of the king bowing down to him puts a fear into you. So too, even in Chutz La'aretz, you're not a dummy. Doesn't mean you just have no clue what's going on. You see the whole world is basically created by Hashem, and everything's like following their course in the sky, and the nature works perfectly. You see there's a master of this place. You see all the hosts of heaven bowing down to him. You don't even know who the king is, but you're already afraid of him. So getting the external fear of Hashem, you can for sure get Chutz La'aretz, because it doesn't have to know with knowing God. It just has to do with seeing his awesomeness, and that you can see anywhere. So external fear is totally for the taking no matter where you are. But to get to the internal fear, it requires Hashem to contract himself, his infinite, into a finite place, and for that it requires you to contract yourself into a finite place. Not any finite place, the one he told you to contract yourself into, which is the one in the path of Torah and mitzvahs. Contract yourself and make yourself do the contorted motions that he asks you to do, and then he will contort himself and do the impossible, make infinity be expressed to a finite entity. So it's mamish. That's why Eretz Yisrael is a place on earth. It's very strange that Hashem has this notion of trying to be finite. God is the infinite God, and on the contrary, the Jews were the people who brought that message to the world, that God is everywhere, God is one, there's nothing other than him. We're all about him being everywhere, and yet we're also the only ones who say he's here and he's not there. Such a contradiction, because what we're trying to say is that if you want a taste of that infinite God, great, he's everywhere, but if you want him to show himself to you, you have to do this and not that. Eat this and don't eat that. Walk here and don't walk there. Touch this and don't touch that. All the finiteness is also not out of God's domain, as we talk about often. So he's going back to that line. When you have the Or Choser, the returning light, and you have both eyes, you have not only the external light that comes because of his greatness, but you also have his inner fear. Yiraboshes. The embarrassed level of fear, which we're saying is awe. Al derek mashakasuv, and this is similar to what it says, chochmas b'chutz taruna. Hainu sheb'chutz yesh chochmas lashon rabim. Hen chochma tata v'hen chochma ilah. So, let me try and explain this line. Again, this is like little quotes from full-blown Maimarim that if you're lucky you can remember sort of their Indian. But here's what he's saying here. Chochmos b'chutz taruna. So it says That's a plural word for chochma. It doesn't say chochma, but chochmos. And when you have chochmos, in other words, when you have both levels of chochma, dafka when they're bechutz. In other words, when you're able to bring the chochma of Hashem and bring it, so to speak, out of Hashem's place of infinity and bring that infinity down and spread it outward into the world below, that's when you wind up with chochmas. You only have chochmas when there's a bechutz. When Hashem is able to bring the inner dimension of infinity and bring it out and express it, that's when you have two levels of chochma. Otherwise, you only are ever left with one level of chochma, the lower chochma, right? The lower fear.
Doesn't the higher level fear include the lower level?
No, but you start off at the lower level. Like the greatness of Hashem, you've never met the king, but you're living in Chutz La'aretz, you recognize Hashem made the world. That's available to you. But that's when it's still inside. That's when his chochma is still inside. When you're just realizing his greatness, his chochma is still inside. Because you haven't seen his true greatness. It hasn't come out and shown himself to you. When it comes out and shows itself to you, b'chutz, that, not like chutz la'aretz, is a little bit, that's what I say, it's a little bit funny, but in other words, chutz of himself, when he shows himself, that's suddenly when you get two chochmas. And then you have taruna, then you have this rina and rejoicing, then you're mamish with God. You have this level of wondrous connection. So it's chochmos, it's only a plural, when Hashem will send himself, his inwardness, and contract it and send it outward, which requires a bittul on your part.
What does it mean that his, like the external parts of Hashem? Like, what does that mean?
So basically this idea of inside and outside. Inside is where it's infinite, okay? And that's called inside because the outside, the world, has no access to it. Why? A finite cannot grasp something infinite.
Right.
So the inside is Hashem's wondrous gedula, as we called it before, the greatness which is just beyond comprehension. And therefore anything which, if you're in this realm, anything which is outside can just sort of from afar see there's something called a king and sort of realize how awesome he is, but he has no knowledge of him. It's because he's a finite entity in the world.
Right.
So that's what it's called inside. When that glorious, awesome infinity will actually show itself, which is totally a miracle. How are you going to show something infinite in a finite place? That's Torah. But he does it because you bittul yourself. So Hashem's like, okay, you're going to bittul yourself, I'll bittul myself. So he brings infinity outside, something which normally cannot be done. It's only God can do such a thing.
Oh.
Put something infinite in a finite place. That's the yud. That's what's called chesed. That's what's called chesed, the small chesed. You make yourself small. He brings his infinity through you because you've nullified yourself. Then he's come b'chutz. His infinity is not only inside, it's also outside.
Okay.
And that means you have two levels of chochma now. Not just the external one of realizing that he's infinite and you'll never understand him, which creates fear on the lower level, but you actually have the inner fear because you're seeing him face to face because he's contracted himself into the yud, which enables you to actually know him.
Okay.
So we have two levels of chochma, and then you're taruna, then you're rejoicing.
It's like another way of saying.
It means like singing. When there's two levels of chochma, which is only when there's bechutz, there's singing.
It's like another way of saying that he retracts himself.
He
Retracts himself.
retracts,
Like contracts.
contracts, right. But we should very much clarify right now that there's two levels of contraction, right? There's contraction where he hides the infinite from the finite, and that's just making the world. That's also a massive contraction.
Right.
But there's a type of contraction where he condenses the infinite and sends it down into the finite. There's a whole different level of contraction. That's like a very positive level of contraction. The first one is that he's just hiding himself so that he can create something finite. The second level of contraction is that he injects all the infinity into a finite place. He doesn't like contract it by removing parts. He contracts it by putting all the infinite and letting it be there in an infinite way, but inside of a finite object, which is the Torah. The Torah is a finite book, beginning and end, but all these books don't even begin to cover what's inside of there because the whole creation and all the 6,000 years of creation could never cover what's inside of there because it's a finite object that contains everything. So that's the yud. That's why B'ezras Hashem when you contract yourself, He'll give you over the infinite and in a finite box so that you can actually hold it. Otherwise you couldn't hold it. It's the gift, matan Torah.
Right, I'm just confused of why it's called his external part of him. Isn't that his panemius?
It is, but when I'm glad you asked that question. But when his panemius comes out, we're calling it, it's not his external part. On the contrary, you get his external part, the external fear, that is, when he's in and he doesn't come out. You get his internal part when he brings the internal externally. That's when you are able to perceive his internal part. You have inner fear.
Oh, he brings his inner part
Out. That's what, it's not called his external part, it's called his inner part out. And that's therefore you get chochmos. You have both levels of chochma because he came b'chutz. It's not his external part. His inner part out. You following?
Yeah.
This is a super question, but I keep, would we learn that we never know Hashem, but then we're talking about that we can know Hashem. So it's a paradox to me, and I'm not sure I understand what it means to know Hashem.
So it's like this. It says, Leis machshava tefisa be'klal. There's no thought that can grasp him at all. But it says, but he can be grasped, let's say, with a mitzvah. So what does it mean? It means to actually know him, it's impossible. You know, to know everything about him, it's impossible. But because he decided to extend his infinite self inside of a finite place, when you grab onto him by doing a mitzvah, which means your body is sort of like enclosed inside and dressing itself up in a divine object, it doesn't mean suddenly you know all of him, but you are holding on and permeated with his essence. The same is true when you learn Torah. When you learn Torah, it's true that you're learning a little piece of information, but that's not what's so cool about learning Torah. It's that your mind is now dressed up with the divine entity himself in an uncontracted way. So there's two ways of knowing him. It's like when you think about knowing something, it's like you're trying to grasp the information. When it comes to the information of Hashem, you can never grasp it all. But even grasping a small part of it, or grasping a mitzvah, means that the entire essence of Hashem is now inside of you. You're holding on to him. Right? So this is the idea, basically. You understand the difference? It's chapters 3 and 4 in Tanya, basically. It's a maybe I'm not giving it over properly, but it's a subtle idea that he puts himself inside of a mitzvah. So when you put on the mitzvah, you dress yourself up in the mitzvah. He is all running through you and like permeating through you in this amazing way. It's not like you know him and you understand him per se.
So the term knowing is sort of...
Right, so that has to be qualified. It's not really knowing him, but at the same time it's complete unification with him.
It's like connecting, or well, it's an intimacy that you create.
You become one with him. It's better than knowing him. Right, and Torah.
It's qualitative, not quantitative.
Right, exactly. And then it says, what's the advantage of Torah versus mitzvahs? Because the Torah is also just a mitzvah. In other words, in the same way you can never know him. So we're not learning Torah in order to like find out who's God per se, because you'll never know. So really the highest thing is just to commune with him with a mitzvah. And Torah is also mitzvah. But Torah has this awesome thing that other mitzvahs, they only access like the external parts of your body. You're going to wave some fruits around, or you're going to put on some tefillin. So you're becoming one with Hashem through dressing up in his garments. But it leaves your inner parts not connected. When you learn Torah, you use your brain, you use your mind, you use your thoughts. So now just like your arm can put on tefillin, your thoughts can put on tefillin, because you're wrapping the words of God inside of your mind. And not only the words, but even the comprehension. So it's not as though you are getting God. But your brain is now all tied up in this, what the Katanya calls this wondrous unity, that the inside of you and the outside of you is like fused with him. Even your emotions, it can get to a point where your love is his love and so forth. It's hard to describe, I must say, but we're trying. Okay. After the parentheses, Mikol ze muvan. From all this, it's understood. Oh, I didn't exactly finish the parentheses. Shebechutz yesh chochmos lashon rabim. To your point, Baruch. Yeah. Outside, suddenly there are two chochmas, lashon rabim, plural. Because when Hashem will bring his inner and send it out, so now you can have also the inner fear. In other words, you can know him as well as just fear him. When you say know him, in other words, have this awe. Hen chochma tata v'hen chochma ilah. Both the higher and now not only the lower but also the higher chochma becomes available to you. Is everyone sort of following all this? Yeah. Okay. Mikol ze muvan ma'alas habitul sha'adam maktinu matzamtzem es atzmo. What does it come out from the end like? Gentlemen, avoda. From all this, it should be understood the awesome quality of nullifying yourself, making yourself small and contracting yourself into the lines of the Torah. Ad l'tachlis shleimas hatzimtzum, to the point that you totally nullify yourself. You don't have a moment in your day, right? Right? Because you don't have not only a moment in time, but your thoughts, your speech, and your action, everything you have, every second, you become a non-entity because only He and His ways are dressing you up. Leislei megar maklum, and every yid has that because we're on aretz, so we have this ability to bittul ourselves, to go to the point of you have nothing of your own. You're like a moon reflecting the fullness of the sun. And if you do that, you will get the full reciprocation of Hashem, which means there's no level of godliness which you could not pass through you, to the point that you could bomb like a Rebbe, you know? The Rebbe used to say, like, how do you know that inside of every chesed, that every chesed is a little bit, is a Rebbe, right? Because you can make another chesed. And the fact that you can make someone into a chesed means you are a Rebbe. So you can. That's a fact. It's inside of you. The question is, how much do you want to bring it out, and that requires your bittul. That by the fullness of our contracting ourselves down here below, in other words, your actions contract them into His actions. That's what enables you to have the full tzimtzum above, i.e., Hashem will put His totality of His infinite into the finite. That Hashem will contract Himself, so to speak. Again, there's two ways to look at contraction. One is He holds back from you His infinite and just shows you the finite. But the one we're talking about is He brings the whole infinite package inside of a finite package. That's what we're saying. That you can now grasp Him. And again, you want to say grasp, we're talking about the mitzvah type of grasp. And there is this principle that the higher something is, the greater its ability to contract itself and fall lower. Like the idea of a wall that falls. The highest part of the wall will fall the furthest away. So usually we say this like a negative. We talked about recently how a negative, like in Eretz Yisrael or the Jerusalem in the time of the Churban. So it fell the furthest. But there's a very, very positive quality to this, which means the highest aspects of Hashem, Dafka, they know how to make themselves infinite. In other words, you might say, how in the world is Hashem going to make Himself the infinite God? How's He going to make Himself finite? But the truth is that the higher aspects of infinity, the higher they go, the more able they are to dress themselves up, and it's not a contradiction to them to be finite. By us, finite and infinite is a contradiction. But by the infinite Hashem, literally nothing, there's no holds barred. So He can make the total infinity and also put it into a finite place. And Dafka, you say, okay, but maybe we have like a sort of watered down version. No, the highest thing, Dafka, falls lowest. So the very peak of Hashem's infinity is the one that's fit to come and be put into a finite place. As it says, the highest and the most exalted holiness level of Hashem will dwell dafke as dake v'shafal ruach. He will dwell specifically in those who are broken of spirit and lowly. In other words, the highest things will reside in those who make themselves the smallest.
5 minutes. Short ois.
Just wrap it up in 5 minutes.
It's a short ois. It's not the longest one.
Zohi nakuda de perek vav. Shalom Maimer. What's that?
We can start tomorrow as well.
Yeah, this is the point of perek vav. Right? We're all trying to learn the 6th chapter in the previous Rebbe's Maimer. Now we've got it. That through nullifying yourself, and that's the general concept that we count our calendar mostly according to the moon, because the moon is an idea of making ourselves small. And the Jewish people are compared to the moon, which means we are standing mitzad our service in a situation of moon-like, and as the moon can go into a state of absolute nullity, there can be a state of no moon. The moon can make herself completely disappear in a state of silence of bittul, like the moment before the moon is even born, there's actually no moon, so we can make ourselves invisible. And through this we reveal the concept of what we said, Yom Hazeh. But Yom Hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. On this day they came to the mountain where they got the Torah. And we said in chapter 3 that in order to get the Torah, there's a condition, you have to make yourself small. And that's why the first stage of preparation of getting the Torah was to come to the mountain on Rosh Chodesh, where there was an idea of the moon being tiny to give us the indication that you're going to get the Torah. The only one who's going to get something infinite in a finite box is if you make yourself finite. If you contract yourself. Therefore, the first preparation of Matan Torah was Rosh Chodesh. In fact, that's the first mitzvah of the Torah we talked about on Shabbos, because that before any mitzvahs, you have to have this union of making yourself small. And through this, they can come to the Mount Sinai and receive the Torah mitzvahs in a way that through them we can change this lowest world. That's what it means. We can make even the finite world into an infinite world. In other words, through the agency of the Torah, we can make worldliness into godliness, which is exactly the point of a Yid. Which means what? Going mamish back to the original mimer, we can turn over the kesher and the sheker, which we said meant like klippa's ability to hold on. Sheker means falseness. And the kuf and the reish, maybe we're going too fast, but for those who are here, the kuf and the reish, which were these like dark letters, which spell the word false, you can transform them into a keresh, which is the same letters, but in a different combination, which means the beams of the tabernacle itself, of the temple itself. And this is the idea of bittling yourself. You can turn even the false, dark world into a godly dwelling place, because you can bring the infinite into a finite place. You don't have to exit the world in order to find God. You can bring God right down into this world, which is the uniqueness of Yiddish philosophy. From this beam, you build a mishkan, you build a home of God. Through it, Hashem says, I will dwell with you. And then you don't finish in the Mishkan. Once you have the Mishkan, we said the windows of the Mishkan open to the outer world. Once a Jew will bring this holiness into himself and into the things close to him, it will, by definition, automatically tikkun olam. It will fix the whole world, because now we have infinity in the world. It can spread to all the parts of the world. Eretz Yisrael will in the future go to every place. And by the fact that we will be in like a status of tzivos Hashem, which means that we will be the army of God. When an army is the idea of like each individual member is a total state of bittul to the king and in uniform, and we walk uniformly and we eat uniformly, and we're mamash following the Torah all together. As we were when we went out of Egypt, we all followed in line. Then it'll get to a point that we will fight the wars of Hashem and win. Which means that the victory will be the people of the army together with the generals of the army. Particularly that the fact that a king will sort of just waste and distribute and generously all of his innermost treasures when it comes to winning the war. That he gathered and that all his fathers gathered, the great wealth of the kingdom will be distributed into the hands of the simple people when it comes time for winning the war. And that, of course, is a metaphor for Hasidus being revealed to us in the final generation. We're going fast. I don't know, David, you got us into this. And those riches will be given through the generals of the war, of the army, which is the Rebbes, into the hands of the simple people, which is us, and we're the ones who have to win the war. We'll build the temple in its place, and then will be that Hashem will dwell with us through by us building him a temple. And just like we went out of Egypt, and he flows in a way of that I will show you wonders. Hashem's miraculous nature came into the world. We'll see even greater than those wonders in the future revelation, which is coming immediately. This will be in our time period, quickly in our days, with Mashiach, our righteous Redeemer, coming. B'nai Yisrael yotzim biyad Ramah. We will go out with an upstretched hand, Bekarov Mamish.
Amen.
Yeah. Just in time for the Abshurnish, the Hachanas for Yud Shvat will continue 3 o'clock. Everybody's welcome to get on the bus. I want to say it's like mandatory for all the people in this room.